Good afternoon. I'm Representative John McGinnis, 79th District, Blair County. As nearly everyone knows, there is an immense financial crisis looming over Pennsylvania's future. One obvious sign is the spate of credit downgrades we've suffered over the past 2 years. With each announcement, the rating services tell us quite clearly the problem is a failure to address the unfunded liabilities of CSRS and PSRS. A more alarming aspect of the problem is represented by the red line on our Tale of Two Futures chart. There is a growing realization that the assets of the pension systems will be fully depleted in 10 to 20 years. When D-Day arrives, that's depletion day, more than 40% of general fund revenues in perpetuity will be necessary to make payouts to retirees, leaving a greatly impaired budget for ongoing government services and education. The window of opportunity for effectively dealing with this problem is closing fast. Today, we are at a decision point, continuing on a course of massive and irreversible damage for the future of Pennsylvania, or changing course with a proper policy of paying off the pension debt. This morning, House Bill 900 has been introduced. When enacted, it will require the unfunded liabilities of CSRS and PSRS to be paid down in a timely and effective manner. It's that simple. House Bill 900 follows the recommendations of the 2014 Blue Ribbon Panel on Public Pension Funding commissioned by the Society of Actuaries by paying off the unfunded liabilities over 20 years with level dollar funding. Level dollar funding assures a path of effectively paying down the debt and avoiding the negative amortization that has been the legacy of Act 120. A 20-year amortization period is necessary for two reasons. First, the average age until retirement for public sector workforce is approximately 20 years, and a pension system needs to be fully funded at that point to avoid shortchanging other government imperatives. Second, any longer delay in funding our pension brings into play D-Day. The complement of our Tale of Two Futures chart, which is the percent of funds available for non-pension purposes, shows a steep decline on D-Day, which is to say, represents a financially crippled Commonwealth. The blue line on both charts represents, however, the path of saving our future through a responsible retirement of the pension debt. Now, I've compiled 3 contribution schedules for demonstration based on House Bill 900 and the most recently certified data from the pension systems, which is not very recent, sorry to say. The first shows a 20-year amortization of the unfunded liability of PSRS. The second shows the same for the unfunded liability of CSRS. And the third combines the two. State and school district pension contributions are about $4.2 billion in the current fiscal year, and we need to take that number to about $6.9 billion in fiscal year 2016. Obviously, this is tough medicine, but the consequences of avoiding it will be much more difficult for future generations to deal with, and they had no part in making this problem. And this medicine is 100% effective for all that ails us. Anybody who says, we simply cannot do this now, it's too difficult, needs to tell us when it will be doable. Albert Einstein said, compound interest is the most powerful force in the universe, and that's great news if you're investing. But if you're on the debt side of compounding, and our state pensions are enormously on the debt side, it's only going to be an increasingly worse problem with each day of delay. I am happy to say an understanding of both the depth of the problem and the imperative of its solution is gathering momentum. I'm grateful to have these folks standing with me today, including Senator Scott Wagner and also a young man named Eric Gutschall running for county controller here in Dauphin County. They stand here with the other folks who will be speaking shortly in support of House Bill 900. They are from across the partisan and ideological spectra. In fact, I think there's more Democrats on the dais today than there are Republicans. All right? They understand that not properly funding benefits that have already been earned spells doom for the future of Pennsylvania. The first one I'd like to introduce is Mr. Barry Schutt. Barry has been seen often in the East Capitol beside a sign that says, "Borrowing money is not a fix. It kicks the can down the road and steals from our children and grandchildren." Barry has been a true citizen advocate for proper and responsible fiscal management. Barry?
Thank you, Mr. McGinnis. As he said, my name is Barry Schutt. I was trained as an accountant and worked as a tax auditor for several years. I also served as an ordained pastor in a church in Lebanon County. And I am a retired state employee, having worked with food assistance programs for 20 years in the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. But I'm here today simply as a grandfather of 3 grandchildren. My interest in pension reform is simple. Borrowing money to pay the $50 billion plus debt is not a fix, as Mr. McGinnis said. It is a problem created by Act 9 by the 2001 version of the General Assembly and by the then governor in charge. And unfortunately, it is a problem that has been allowed to fester by the inactions of subsequent versions of the General Assembly and governors. My grandchildren and your grandchildren and some of your children should not be expected to pay for the problems created before they were born. This generation created the problem. This generation needs to find a way to pay for the fix. One of the most outrageous parts of Act 9, and the part that infuriates taxpayers who take the time to understand it, is the granted enhanced benefits which were retroactively granted to state employees, school district employees, and school teachers. It gave enhanced benefits for years of service when the employees did not pay in extra for those enhanced benefits, nor did their employers pay in extra for those benefits. It was the biggest generational theft in my lifetime, and I'm 67 years old. That part of the Act 9, the enhanced benefits, in my mind, should be rolled back, and new benefits of Act 9 prorated based on the employee's years of service. In my retirement, if my retirement were prorated, my factor would be 2.11 instead of 2.5. Would I take a hit? Yes, I would. But giving up that retroactivity is a small price to pay to restore solvency to Pennsylvania state pension programs. But we are here in this situation now, and we got to find a way to fix it. HB 900 is an important step to have the General Assembly and the governor commit to finding a way to pay for the fix, not borrow, but to pay for that fix. It's time for all stakeholders to get into a room, shut the door, and honestly engage in a give and take to find a payment plan that uses in each budget year current revenues to make the payments. If everyone gives a little, maybe even bending a little on ideology, we can get this fixed. We owe that to our grandchildren. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry. Before I bring up the next speaker, I just want to mention that Will Tallman has shown up. He heard something about not enough Republicans up here, so here he is. I'm happy to introduce a good friend of mine and a person certainly apprised of this issue, Representative Steve Bloom.
Thank you, Representative McGinnis. And I have 2 quick disclaimers and then 2 points. First, I'm a state representative. I also serve as a member of the PSERS Board of Trustees, and I want to make it clear that my remarks today are given in my capacity as a state representative and an individual member of the PSERS Board, but by no means should be interpreted to reflect the views of the PSERS Board overall or of the PSERS organization. Secondly, I found that as a state representative, as a legislator, no one cares what I say about pension reform until they find out that upon my election back in 2010, I immediately signed the papers to permanently, irrevocably refuse to participate in the legislative pension program. So I'm not getting a pension as a state legislator, and I feel it's just necessary to put out there because I know that's always the first question I get from people. Well, don't you get it? I chose not to get it because I didn't want to get sucked into the system and then lose my zeal to reform the system. Why is this bill that Representative McGinnis is proposing good for Peasers? As a Peasers board member with a fiduciary duty to the tens of thousands of beneficiaries who have a vested interest in their retirement benefits, this bill would make Peasers financially whole. It would enable Peasers to fulfill those obligations, and as a fiduciary, I feel compelled to support the bill because otherwise we're potentially putting folks at risk that their benefits that they've been promised legally and ethically may not be there in the future. So I support the bill because it's good for Peasers, good for the beneficiaries, and it's the only bill I've seen that actually does this, that actually fully funds the program, that the promises that have been made. The second point I'd like to make, though, about the substance of this issue is the fact that this bill is the only one of its kind that I've seen in my 4.5 years down here, and the fact that it is viewed as potentially not politically viable, something that may be out there as a radical idea, but probably not something that the House or the Senate's actually going to pass. The fact that political wisdom is kind of floating around the building, to me, proves the very flaw that's inherent with a government-defined benefit pension plan. We, the government, the legislators, the governor, historically and currently, lack the discipline to do what's necessary to actually pay for the promises that we're making. So I support this bill, but I also would point out that the prognosticators who say this bill is not likely to proceed are proving the point that governments are simply not fit to run a defined pension benefit program. Thank you. Thank you, Representative McGinnis.
Thanks, Steve. You know, another D just came to my mind, D-Day for depletion day, but D for discipline. If this bill is enacted, we will be forced to make good on the benefits that have already been earned. Next up is Senator John Eichelberger, Chair of the Finance Committee in the Senate, and he has assured me of fast passage of House Bill 900 when it gets to the Senate.
I was just speaking about the Finance Committee part. I don't know about anything else, but I appreciate being here today and sharing the dais with a lot of good people. And Representative McGinnis, who is in my immediate area and has the expertise. If you don't know, he has his PhD in finance. He was a professor at Penn State. So he's very knowledgeable about this issue and other issues that affect public finance. So it's important to have a leader like that at the helm of a bill that's this critical. There are three components to the pension problem that we have today: the plan design, the funding, and then how the money's invested. All of them are very important. We're trying to address in Senate Bill 1 the very generous plan design that employees have today and make some changes to that so that it's affordable for the future and sustainable for the future. We're also looking to form a commission that would study how the money's invested, so we can do a critique and maybe make some changes of how the money's handled, the billions of dollars that are invested annually and all the costs that's involved with that, to make sure that we have low risk, profitable, low cost investments of that money, so that helps the account as opposed to hurts it. The piece that is not very strong in the Senate bill, is almost not there at all, almost non-existent, is the funding requirement. As Representative Bloom said, this is the only bill out there that I've seen in the 8 years I've been here, 8 years for me, that strictly addresses this funding component. We have to fund the plan we have. We have a contractual commitment to fund this. We have a moral obligation to fund this, and so far we haven't done a very good job of funding it. Although I would point out to everyone that that's not the entire problem with the pension plan. The very generous benefit package we have is part of it, and risking this on a daily basis with investments in the stock market is part of our loss and part of the problem that we have. It contributed to the unfunded liability that we currently have. So his plan, the McGinnis plan, is something that we critically need to get through the system, and I'm going to do everything I can in the Senate side to help. Thank you for all you're doing, John.
Thanks, John.
You bet.
Next up, I'd like to bring to the podium Representative Paul Schemmel. With 6 children ranging in age from 5 to 18, Representative Schemmel has perhaps a bigger stake in this issue than most Pennsylvanians. Paul?
Thank you, John. Most of us in this room can credit our predecessors for our own success in life. Indeed, intergenerational sacrifice has been part of our country from the very beginning, when our founding fathers laid aside their own fortunes and their own success for the good of us all. But regrettably, under the current system, under the current program, if left unchanged, we will go from intergenerational sacrifice to intergenerational theft. Now, as the good representative remarked, I have 6 kids from age 18 to 5. In fact, my 5-year-old was supposed to be here today, but fortunately her program manager, my wife, did not find a way to accommodate that. But because of that, in a family that large, with one income, we make sacrifices. We have used furniture, our vacations, our car trips to visit family, and I drive a 23-year-old Buick. So we make various sacrifices in order to provide for the financial stability of our family. And this is something, too, that our state needs to do, which is make financial sacrifices in order to provide for the stability not only of our current retirees, but certainly of future generations. Now, similar to Representative Bloom, I myself, when I entered the House of Representatives this year, forever and irrevocably waived the option to have a pension. That's a benefit I left on the table. That was payments for the rest of my life that I chose willingly not to accept, because I did not believe that I could imperil the future of my children and my own impartiality in this debate. So I either must be a colossal fool, or I am hopeful for the future. I would say that the imperative is clear, the time is now, and I am hopeful that we as a Commonwealth will do the right thing for our current retirees and for our future generations. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Paul. Hopeful for the future or a colossal fool, they're not mutually exclusive, Paul. Rick Dreyfuss is up next. He's an actuary, a retired human resources executive, and an adjunct scholar at the Manhattan Institute. And without question, he is the single most dedicated person in the Commonwealth to reforming the pension system that jeopardizes our future. Rick?
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge Representative McGinnis's leadership in House Bill 900. It is indeed a unique piece of legislation. It is long overdue, and it's a key element missing in most public pension reform discussions. That is, how do we properly fund these plans? And in general, we're dealing with overstated assets in these plans, understated liabilities coupled with poor funding practices. And in the actuaries I'm talking with, it's not a question of what will the problems be, but when will insolvency occur. So to achieve comprehensive and sustainable pension reform, we really need 2 elements. We need plan design reforms, which up to this point has occupied probably about 99% of the debate, plus we need funding reforms, as evidenced in House Bill 900. And unfortunately, there's a very low political rate of return in properly funding these pension systems. There's no ribbon cutting, and it's hard to point to a tangible asset as a result of good funding practices. And in fact, if you benchmark Pennsylvania against other states, we rank very close to the bottom. Only New Jersey has shortchanged its plan more in terms of paying its own recommended contributions. And the actuaries in this are effectively scorekeepers. I mean, they are part of the system, but indeed, they are not the sole determinant of how much money goes into these systems. So while these actuarial concepts can be complex, we need to be intellectually honest in this discussion and reaffirm that pensions are effectively deferred wages. Pension costs are part of an individual's employment benefit package, which are part of the overall pay and benefit package that every employee receives. So it's in the cost of education, it's in the cost of transportation, it's in the cost of nursing care. And as Representative McGinnis said, if you look at the demographics of our school employees' retirement system, we're dealing with an average age of maybe 45, and if you assume on average people retire at about 60 to 62, that suggests that a 20-year amortization period is indeed the appropriate benchmark. And that supports the concept of intergenerational equity, which is a fancy word for saying that the benefits ought to be funded as they're earned, and therefore those costs ought to be paid for during that same period of time. So there's no joy in amortizing costs over exceeding 20 years, and very often we have our public school system with a 24-year backloaded amortization, and we have our schools, our state employee system with a 30-year amortization, and we're not even paying those amounts. To tell you how bad it is, we're essentially 2 dimensions removed from this problem. And there's no plan design scenario justifying amortization of 30 years. And just to put this in some context, if you look at the Pennsylvania municipal retirement plans, most of them are on a 20-year amortization schedule, and we definitely need more reform with regard to those particular systems. So going to that standard, while it may be a difficult fiscal lift, is nothing that remarkable. And in fact, if you look at the private sector, they're required to amortize any deficits, unfunded liabilities, over 7 years, 15 years in some cases. So this is a bill that is timely and should be enacted, and again, I'd like to acknowledge Representative John McGinnis's leadership in this area. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. I can't say how honored I am to have Representative Caltagirone as a co-sponsor on this bill and standing with us today. Tom's integrity is unquestioned and unsurpassed, and he's in the vanguard, and that's a small v, in the vanguard of pension reform. Tom?
Thank you, John. I'll keep this short. For the last several weeks, John and I have been working very closely on this very issue, and the point is, doing nothing is not an option. We've got to wrestle with this bear and come up with some kind of a solution. This is the very first step. We have other legislation that'll be following that hopefully will start to deal with this very issue. So I just want to say thank you, John, for your leadership.
Thanks, Tom. Our final speaker, before we get to your questions, I reckon you've heard about. Eric J. Epstein is the coordinator of Rock the Capitol. Mr. Epstein has been a community advocate for good government for over 25 years, has taught adult education for over 18 years, and has served as a school board director, an interesting perspective on this issue, since 2013. Eric?
Thanks. I just want to make sure, can everybody hear me in the back? I'm Eric Epstein of Rock the Capitol. We have folders of our presentation here today, and it will also be on our website tonight. The reason I'm here is I think every political roast needs a Don Rickles, so I'm not really interested in sparing anybody's feelings. Let me just go over a couple facts, and I also want to give a lot of credit to John and also Rick and everybody up here because we've tried to work across the aisle. I first met John last year. He had a root beer. I did not. Almost 14 years ago to the day, Governor Ridge signed into law Act 9 with an overwhelming support from the legislature. If you refer to our Exhibit A and B, you can see who voted for the legislation. Fact, the legislation did not provide a revenue mechanism to fund increased benefits. If you look to our Exhibit C, you'll see a 3-page summary on the genesis of the act. And this is what I think one of the more important facts, and again, it's an opinion, but Act 9 is not going to be repealed, rescinded, or revoked. Based on legal precedents established by the Pennsylvania courts in 1934, 1960, and 1984, and if you look at our handout, we have those legal citations. Fact, we have a $53 billion revenue hole that needs to be filled. That's a fact. The Pew Foundation found that Pennsylvania is 49th in funding its public pension employees, as Richard had talked about before. That's nothing to be proud of. That means we're 49th in taking care of the obligations that we are contractually obligated to take care of. This solution to the pension crisis is not more borrowing. Not more borrowing. The solution to the pension crisis is not artificial collars. And we're not going to solve the pension crisis, and I don't want to offend anybody here, by creating another commission composed of some of the same people who created the problem. And to another gentleman who occupies the governor's mansion, we also have to acknowledge that we have a crisis. The solution to the problem is to eliminate the unfunded liabilities of CSRS and PSRS over 20 years with level dollar funding. That's a solution. This is the standard established by the 2014 Blue Ribbon Panel on Pension Funding that was commissioned by the Society of Actuaries. This financial solution will be painful and require shared sacrifice. There's no magic wand to solve the problem. Everybody's going to have to give a little. In order to eliminate the unfunded liabilities, state and school district pension contributions will increase from approximately $4.1 billion in this current fiscal year to $6.6 billion in fiscal year 2016. If you voted to increase benefits without a commensurate revenue stream, and if you stand to gain from that legislation, then you can support a vote for a solution. Our opinion, it's time for all the legislators from the backbenchers to leadership, as well as the governor, to buckle up their chin straps, put on their shoulder pads, and announce a special session to be held over the summer to deal with the pension crisis. You're probably going to be here anyway. Waging pension peace is harder than waging pension war, but inaction has the same effect as placing a noose around the neck of our children's future. We will need to make spending cuts. If you look in your package, you will refer back to Rock to Capital's recommendations for spending cuts in fiscal year 2009-2010, which weren't obviously acted upon. We found $559 million in what we thought were painless cuts, I guess, unless you're the person being cut. We will also need a dedicated and protected revenue stream. We proposed a financial transaction tax, which I know is not supported by many people here on the dais, but it is a means of addressing skyrocketing property taxes, providing COLAs to folks who haven't had COLAs in 12 to 13 years, who have never had a COLA at all, and securing a dedicated pension revenue stream. And that plan is also in your packet. Today, we are announcing a campaign to liberate hostage taxpayers. You can't be a bystander and watch a runaway train derail our children's future. You can either get on board or get out of the way, but being neutral is not an option.
Thanks, Eric.
I got to get my shirt back to Hendricks.
I'll tell you when I knew this bill was a really good idea. It was a few minutes after I sent out the co-sponsorship memo at the end of March. The very first person to co-sponsor was Representative Nick Kodik, a Democrat, and the first Democrat in 5 years to have his name on a pension bill. Nick is a stand-up guy who recognizes the simple moral truth that when you incur costs, you need to pay for them. Before we go to your questions, let me ask a few rhetorical ones. We know the problem was caused by chronic and systemic underfunding, and we know the only solution is a substantial increase in funding. So here are the rhetorical questions. If not today, when? If it's too difficult now, how will it be easier later? How can we set about spending current revenue dollars on new expenses when we've let past expenses unpaid to the tune of $55 billion and currently have no suitable plan to address them? We have a moral duty to pay for pension benefits when they are earned. We have a constitutional mandate to balance our budget, and that doesn't happen when pension expenses are deferred. And we have an economic imperative to make sufficient contributions to save Pennsylvania's future. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions. Mr. Owens.
Representative, Senate Bill 1 is obviously getting buzz over in the Senate. Have you looked at that bill? How is yours significantly different from that?
You can look at the reform of pension topic in three parts. There's a design part, as Senator Eichelberger pointed out, There's a management part, which has to do with how the monies are invested and managed, and then there's a funding part. Senate Bill 1 does nothing on funding and addresses those other two areas. And again, I would say just from a political perspective, the design component is going to be a tough accomplishment because Democrats and Republicans are far apart on what can be done design-wise. The governor has mentioned some initiatives on management, so there's some perhaps possibilities there. But the funding issue is not up for debate. It's an imperative that if not addressed will sink the future of Pennsylvania, and I'm not being melodramatic in saying that. We're talking a general fund that will be cut in half. How do you run an education system when half your money is going to retirees and you're now left with only 50% what you used to get? And you can say, well, let's raise taxes on the rest of Pennsylvanians. Well, that doesn't work. You know, we're driving people away from this state. We're making young people our #1 export. That needs to stop, and one of the ways to stop it is to start properly funding the pensions. Yes, sir.
On that, suggestions to fund the public pensions, because we're talking some pretty big numbers here.
We are, and usually the first question I get, and Eric touched on this, is, okay, McGinnis, level fund, $6.9 billion a year, where are you going to get that money? What I have to point out is a couple things. One of them a cynical perspective, but nonetheless, I think a real one, is that first, the bill is designed to be as clean as possible. This is an issue that is beyond the partisan scale. It's an economic urgency of the highest regard, and the bill just says, it just creates a funding schedule. A schedule of contributions that solves the problem, and it does solve the problem. But where's that money going to come from? That's why we have an appropriations process. That's why we have budget discussions. And when Act 120 was passed, and when Act 40 was passed in 2003, and Act 38 in 2002, all three of those pension bills had funding schedules, and nobody asked then, where's the money going to come from? They just assume it's going to come out of the general revenues. And you should assume that because pensions are no different than salaries and health care benefits. They are direct cost of providing government and educational services. So where are the revenues coming from? Out of the general fund revenues. Will they need to be increased through tax increases, or will we need to redirect current revenues? I bet it's going to take both of those. But don't say the bill has to solve that problem when we have a whole process in place. And those the appropriations chair and our leaders get paid big money compared to our rank and file. They're good enough to solve that problem, and I'm confident they will solve that problem, but they have to have the imperative to solve the problem, and that's what House Bill 900 does.
There was a suggestion by Representative Calderon there might be legislation following this. Would that following legislation more address the numbers then, or?
I think, and Tom can speak to this, he was talking more about the management issues of CSRS and PSRS because there's reasons for concern that they're not operating as effectively as they could. And we're concerned about that, and Tom has done a lot of work and research in that regard. But I think that's what, Tom, fair enough? And Eric, you want to?
Well, just a school board member's perspective, I don't know if anybody else here is on a school board, but if you look at last year, 164 school districts basically voted to increase taxes above the index. I don't know what the number is this year, but that's 1 out of 3 schools. The index this year is 1.9%, so doing nothing is a de facto property tax. I mean, we are dealing with double-digit PSRS contribution increases every year for the foreseeable future. So when you say funding stream, our only remedy at this point is to increase property taxes, which as a school board member is not really something anybody enjoys doing. But I would point out, if 1/3 of the school districts increased the index last year, I don't know what it'll be this year. I know our PSERS contribution has increased. So I think one of the trends you're going to see by having no action to address this bill is that property taxes are going to continue to steadily increase across the state. And I happen to think that property taxes are a regressive and unfair tax. I don't know how other people feel, but doing nothing actually penalizes property tax payers.
Let me just add two other points, because I forgot the one from my cynical nature. But you hear from at budget time about structural deficits and cost of carry budget items that go up each year, and now where are we going to get the new revenues? I hear this every year in the budget debate. House Bill 900 creates a situation where the cost of carry is zero. The first lift is the hard lift. We go to about 6.8, 6.9 billion, and it's level funding after that. It doesn't go up after that. That's significant. That's an effective tool to deal with a long-term problem, but it requires a certain amount of will up front. The cynical part of this is, again, people are challenging me to come up with the appropriations fix, to create a fiscal tool that's going to magically balance the trade-offs that go on during an appropriations process to fund this bill. My cynical point of view says those people are bringing this up because they want another excuse to underfund the pensions. We've had 15 years of excuses for not putting in the right amount of money to pay for benefits that are being earned. The excuses need to stop. Yes, Mr. Jones.
I've had a lot of amortization talk. I'm a TV guy. I need to just get a sound bite here. Explain what your bill would do. Is it basically saying we're going to put $6 billion starting next year, and then for 20 years, $6 billion? Is that basically what it does?
It is, but 15 years of excuses is enough? Isn't a good soundbite? Come on.
That was awesome, and everything to me. But that's as far as what your bill does.
That's right. It's, I don't want to say it's like a mortgage, but in terms of the stream, it is exactly like a mortgage. It's a level payment of, and it only changes because of the newly earned benefits. Depending on what our payroll is, there's going to be marginal changes, perhaps up a little bit, perhaps down, because the post-Act 120 new employees will have a lower normal cost. I don't want to get too much into the details here, but essentially, yes, it's level. It's going to be 6.8, 6.9 billion for 20 years, and then it's going to drop dramatically.
But you wouldn't touch benefits for current employees?
Don't have to.
Recommend future employees go into 401k, or you're not even doing that?
Well, I think that's good policy change to put employees into a 401k plan. I think that's a good policy plan. That's a good design. But that's irrelevant to the what's the real problem. The real problem is the $55 billion monster that's eating our future. And there's only one way to slay that monster, and it's very simple. I mean, this isn't Wile E. Coyote, contacting Acme Electronics to catch a roadrunner with whatever contraption they send them. This is a simple fix to an awful problem, but it's an effective fix.
So basically, if we can find the $6+ billion and we make sure that it's recurring revenue, we can solve this problem this year.
We found it. There's going to be $30 billion of revenue, all right, in the coming fiscal year. 30. What gets top priority? I would argue the 15 years of expenses that haven't been paid deserve top priority. Now you got 23 billion left over for other things. Now, start talking about those other things. Let's not say, well, McGinnis, you haven't come up with a plan for how you're going to fund these old expenses. Well, heck. I don't have a time machine, or I would go back and come up with those revenues. But right now, we have $30 billion of revenues coming into the general fund. I would argue the number one priority for those monies is the pension, and we're not paying off the whole $55 billion at once. We're amortizing it over 20 years. Yes, sir.
What are the political ramifications? I don't see any leaders on the stage.
I'm delighted to say that Speaker Turzai is on the bill. We talked for 20 minutes yesterday, and he appreciated my work on it, and I think, again, I said in my remarks that there's a momentum of understanding of this issue. Not just how it came to be, and not just how big it is, but what the impact is going to be on Pennsylvania's future. And I think Speaker Turzai is there. Certainly, he's shown great support by putting his name on the bill. And again, I can't say again how thrilled I am with Representative Calderon's name on the bill. Getting Democrat support, Nick Kodik as well. And I've had long discussions with other people on the other side. I've spoken with people like the Auditor General and Gene Barr at the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry. And by the way, the PSEA. And they and I agree on nothing. The PSEA spokesman said, this is an interesting and responsible plan. Who would have thought? So I think this is doable politically. I think it's absolutely essential for our future, and we'll push it forward. Anything else? Yes?
How do you keep them on the 20-year track when they always go off after a while?
You know, you have that problem with anything.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question is, how do you keep the 20-year schedule in place? How do you keep everybody on track? And the problem with any legislation is it can be repealed the day after it's passed. New legislation go in. You know, in Act 120, we said there will never be pension obligation bonds, yet here we are a few years later talking about pension obligation bonds. Not just a bad idea, but the worst ever, by the way. But the good thing about House Bill 900 is the first lift is the hard lift. Everything after that is zero cost to carry. So no, I can't assure you that it won't be changed and everybody will stay on track, but it sure will be easy to stay on track. So that's the best I can do. Again, any legislation done today can be undone in the future. But this puts such a, again, the momentum word into place that I can't see why people would deviate from it in the future. Yes, sir.
Is raising revenues or looking for where you can find new revenues on the table for this or no? Looking for taxes or where tax rates are at?
Again, the bill is about committing to a funding schedule for benefits that have already been earned. Will that take increased revenues? Maybe, and that's what the appropriations process will decide. Will it take redirecting current revenues? Maybe. Will it take a combination? Maybe. And I'm going to be I'll be fighting those battles too, but those battles are the good battles because you're fighting to save the future of Pennsylvania, but it's not saved if we don't pass House Bill 900 first and make the commitment. Everybody good? Well, yeah, I sure appreciate you being out today. Take care.